Absolute wisdom cannot be expressed in words, not because the enlightened people want to hide it, but because of language inherently incapable of containing it. Whatever is expressed in words becomes a distorted version of the truth. Words are just tools, but when used to describe something beyond ordinary cognitive abilities, it is like trying to scoop up the ocean with a small cup of human thought that is limited by the very language system it uses. When we talk about something, we are using pre-existing concepts to express, but the ultimate wisdom is not a concept. It is a living reality that cannot be framed in any thinking system. As soon as we assign a name to it, it has become something else, something that can be defined, misinterpreted, interpreted in a myriad of different ways. This is why enlightened beings often avoid answering metaphysical questions directly, using the example of the Buddha when someone asks about the universe. As for the existence after death or about the absolute nature of reality, he chose to remain silent, not because he did not know, but because any answer would create false attachments. If he said there was an afterlife, man will grasp it as an absolute truth, while reality is beyond all the concept of yes or no. If he says that nothing after death, will fall into nihilism, which is also not true. Language always brings people into duality, while absolute wisdom is outside that dichotomy. Enlightened beings understand that if they try to communicate verbally, the listener will understand in their own way, not by the true nature of truth. People have a store of personal data accumulated from life experience, and when they hear something, they automatically interpret it based on what they already know. But the ultimate truth cannot be approached that way. If a person is not experienced enough, they will only grasp a small part of the truth, or worse, they will be completely wrong. Which is why the great intellectuals in history have tended to use the indirect method to teach students. They don't give a straightforward answer, they use guidance for learners to find their own answers through their own experiences, because when truth is realized directly, it ceases to be a concept, it becomes a living truth, beyond our every word. The human brain is not designed to be directly aware of reality. Ultimate from birth, we have been programmed to think according to patterns that use causal logic to explain the world, but absolute wisdom does not operate in such a way that it has no beginning, no end, is not bound by time or space. While our thinking is based entirely on the division and definition of the Dunning-Kruger effect, is a clear demonstration of how people misunderstand the intellect, that those who know little often think that they have understood it all, while those who actually reach a high level of understanding are more aware of the limitations of their thinking. This explains why the more enlightened the true masters are, the less they speak or even refuse to explain directly. They cannot convey absolute wisdom verbally because the listener can only receive it to a certain extent, and in many cases that degree is completely deviated. That the human brain works in a linear way. That is, it is always looking for cause and effect, always trying to impose a certain order on the world. But the reality is dark. Often there is no such linearity. One can ask, where will we go after we die? But this question defaults to, there must be a place after death, when in reality the concept of where to go only makes sense in three-dimensional space that we live in. When enlightened beings refuse to answer, not because they don't know, but because any answer will be misunderstood. In the same way that human limiting thinking is like you're trying to explain color to a person born blind. You can describe red as hot and blue as cold, but no matter how hard you try, the person still can't really do it. Understanding the meaning of the color, they will only relate it to what they already know feels hot and cold, but the essence of colors that are still beyond their ability to perceive. The same as when enlightened beings try to talk about reality. Ultimate listeners will only understand it according to what they have experienced before, which is almost always wrong. This is also the reason that many people hear about concepts such as selflessness, space-time, non-duality, often find it difficult to understand or even dismiss them. Clearly the brain is not programmed to accept those things. Naturally, it always seeks stability, clarity, while absolute wisdom is the dissolution of all definitions. So if a person is not cognitively ready, They will not be able to understand what the enlightened beings are trying to convey, even when explained in the clearest, and therefore the enlightened people choose to be silent or only lead the student to a state that they can realize for themselves the truth, because only through direct experience can one truly understand. Bodhidharma, the founder of Zen Buddhism, when he arrived in China, did not teach at length, nor did he try to convince anyone of the truth. He just sat quietly in meditation opposite the wall for 9 years. Without saying a word, the people around him did not understand. They looked at him with suspicious eyes, even considered him a madman. But those who are lucky enough to recognize it will understand that he does not teach by words but by his own absolute presence. 9 years of meditation is not a meaningless silence, but the most powerful message. The truth cannot be expressed in words, cannot be framed in thought or conception. It can only be seen directly in the deep stillness of the mind. If you are still searching outside, you still need someone to explain. It means that you are not ready yet, because true wisdom does not come from books. It does not come from the teachings but can only be realized in absolute awareness within yourself. Another story tells of a Zen student who came to the teacher and asked about the absolute truth. But instead of answering the teacher, he just smiled. The yogi continues to ask day after day, but still receives only a smile or silence. His patience gradually depletes his mind. He was full of doubts, whether he didn't know the answer or if he was testing me. But then one day, when his mind completely lets go of skepticism, when he no longer expects an answer from the outside, suddenly he is enlightened precisely in the moment of no longer looking for him. Realizing that the answer has never been in words. It has always been there, even in his own silence. In a moment of silence where there is no question, there is no longer a desire, and that is also the nature of true wisdom. Once it is realized, every question becomes meaningless. Krishnamurti, one of the great enlighteners of the 20th century, was once expected to become the spiritual leader of a large organization, where thousands of people were willing to follow him as an enlightened master. But in 1929 he stunned the whole world when announcing the dissolution of his organization, abandoning all titles, all teaching systems, and frankly declaring, "The truth is that there is no entrance, no path to the truth." He rejects all forms of teaching. Tradition is not because he denies the truth, but because he understands an important truth. When people cling to any doctrine, they will turn it into a belief system instead of experiencing reality for themselves. They will no longer really seek the truth, but only looking for a path where there is a dogma available to cling to. But the truth cannot be framed in a system, cannot be simulated or follow a predetermined route. If a path is mapped out, that humans will follow it mechanically. But it was not an awakening but just an unconscious obedience, so he accepted no one as a student. Do not let anyone follow him. Do not build a religion. Do not let anyone turn his words into a doctrine. He forces people to find their own path, because if you really want to see the truth, you can follow in the footsteps of others. You have to walk on your own. All these stories lead to a common point. Wisdom is not in words, but in the very quiet perception that if a person is still looking for an answer through their thoughts, they will only receive concepts. Ideas have been distorted by dualistic thinking, but when they let go of each question, when they no longer crave an answer from the outside, when they actually face themselves without any explanation, then the truth will reveal itself, not as an idea, but as a living reality that cannot be expressed. So how can learners realize it for themselves? If absolute wisdom cannot be conveyed verbally, if the masters refuse to explain it to the end, then what should the learner do to realize the truth for himself? Stop looking for an available answer. That is the first thing a learner needs to realize. If you are looking for an enlightened person, with the desire to hear a final truth, an absolute answer, from that moment you went in the wrong direction. Because anything that can be expressed in words is not the real truth. Every answer, no matter how perfect it may seem, is also just a small piece of truth, and if you cling to it you will lock yourself in a frame of mind, a belief system that never really touches the reality of the great enlightened beings. They do not need established dogmas that do not establish a belief system so that others who follow them know that whatever is expressed will also become an obstacle, because when people cling to an idea, They will stop there instead of experiencing it themselves. So if a certain knowledge makes you feel bound, if a certain theory makes you only believe, without observing yourself, stop, examine yourself, look deeply at yourself, and don't rush to believe anything, including things that are said by the people you respect the most, because the truth is not in words. It can only be realized in your own wakefulness. There is a common mistake that most people make. They think that knowledge and intellect are one and the same. They think that a person who reads many books of profound knowledge can debate philosophical issues or science. It is a person with wisdom, but this is not true. Knowledge is something that can be learned, can be copied from others, can be memorized and used as a tool, but the intellect is completely different. It cannot be taught, cannot be copied, cannot be achieved by simply reading or listening. Wisdom is not something that can be accumulated. It is a state of consciousness that a person who reads hundreds of books on meditation knows all the theories of enlightenment. It is possible to explain clearly the selflessness of absolute truth. But when the person is faced with loss and suffering, they still react in the same way that many others are afraid of clinging to anger. Their knowledge cannot help them escape, for they are just things borrowed from the outside. They know about enlightenment, but they don't live in enlightenment. This is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is intellectual information, which is a deep understanding from within. A person can learn about the impermanent nature of the world, but only when they actually see everything dissolve before their eyes. When a loved one dies, when fame fades, when the things they once believed in collapse, then they truly understand what impermanence is. That understanding is no longer a concept but a living cognition, an indisputable, obvious fact. And that is the wisdom of a person who can read about love, listen to poems praising love, but if they have never loved, all they know is that they can describe love in fancy words, but they don't really understand it. In the same way, a person can speak very well of enlightenment, but if they have never experienced the moment of awakening for themselves, then all they say is still just a repetition of others. So how to develop the intellect? Instead of just accumulating knowledge, experience instead of just reading, observe instead of just analyzing, live with reality instead of trying to define it. If you want to understand the silence of enlightened beings, don't just read about it, practice silence yourself. If you want to understand meditation, don't just learn about it, sit down for yourself and feel the present moment. If you want to understand impermanence, don't just listen to others talk about it. Look directly at the changes that are happening in your life. Knowledge can be forgotten, but wisdom is not. When one truly understands something with one's whole soul, that understanding becomes an inseparable part of them, which is why masters do not teach like a professor, but they guide learners to their own experience, because only when you see and understand for yourself will wisdom really emerge. Not all enlightened beings choose to remain silent or teach. Only a few who have ever had enlightened beings trying to spread the truth widely. But what is the result when a truth is taught too much that it gradually becomes corrupted? What is pure, enlightening, original will be distorted, simplified, and even taken advantage of to serve purposes that were not originally intended. When Buddhism was in its primitive form, it was not a religion with a monastic system, complex rituals, or rigid teachings. The Buddha simply pointed out the way for people to free themselves from suffering. But as this doctrine spreads, it no longer retains its originality.